Hey everybody, welcome to Always Bored, Never Boring. Today, something a little bit different. I'm going to take a look at Blade Oath, which was the exclusive Silver Templars book, which was an additional purchase as part of the Warhammer 40,000 Conquest magazine subscription. This book was priced at $9.99 and it's actually a novella, quite a short one. It's a short read. And I'll be honest, I'm a little bit loath to review a book. As a writer myself, that it makes me feel a little bit awkward to review a novel. But I do have some things I want to say about this. There are some things I want to share. So in this review, I'm going to take a quick look at the quality of the product itself, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the writing style of Andy Clark, who's the author, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the story without going into spoilers. Hopefully, some people will find that interesting. I've actually looked at this book in a previous video, and I've already talked about the fact that it's quite a slim volume. And I've also talked about the fact that my copy arrived quite badly dinged up because it was sandwiched between different frames of plastic miniatures. But obviously, having read it, I can shine a light on some of the other things that just look a little bit sloppy. Nothing deal-breaking, but things that personally I feel should have been picked up on. So, for a start, this is called Blade Oath. 2 words, Blade Oath. I immediately noticed that all the way through the book, at the top of every page, they have the title of the book as a single word, Blade Oath. Like I say, it's not a major thing, but that sort of thing just makes it look like a book has been thrown together a little bit haphazardly. There's also quite a few typos. There's areas where there's like a full stop and a comma, a few misplaced words. There's one particular point. It's actually the very start of a chapter, and it's the start of chapter 3. I'm not going to read a huge amount here, but it does start the chapter with quite an obvious error in the text. It says, "Poxwalkers stumbled towards Captain Keltos, their putrid features, some so wide that they had split skin and torn tendons in the creature's jewels." So there's obviously something missing there. I should imagine there was some reference to their rictus smiles or something, which is just missing from there. And again, that's just there when you're publishing a book. There are certain tolerances. There are a certain number of errors and mistakes that are kind of allowed through and are still considered to be reasonable within the tolerances of what's being published. But something like that seems like quite a major one. It's like the whole sentence doesn't make sense. It's not a misplaced comma. It's not a slightly misspelled word or a duplicate word. It's something that just makes the sentence a little bit meaningless. There's also a point a little bit later on, if I can skip ahead. And again, trying not to give anything away really in this story. Here we have on page 69, there's a sentence here that says, "As he spun, Thessalon had a fleeting impression of a revolting mass of green-brown flesh." And then, a little bit further down the same page, "Thessalon had a fleeting impression of huge shapes." So it's exactly the same phrasing, exactly the same words, exactly the same character, having exactly the same fleeting impression of something on the same page of the book. Now, I mean, every now and again phrases do get repeated in a book, but it's not that common to see 2 references on 1 page. So there's just a few things like that give the impression that the book has been thrown together a little bit on the quick side, and perhaps could have done with one more parse through just to tighten it up just a little bit. There's nothing in there that's a huge problem. There's nothing there that's really going to ruin your enjoyment of reading the book. It's just things that personally I feel should have been perhaps picked up on. But overall, it's a very nicely produced book. Hachette are in the business of making books, making printed material, and this is a nice book. It's of comparable quality, really, to the books that they did for the Horus Heresy Partworks series. I only ever picked up the first one of those, but it was a nicely produced book, and this is on par with that. In terms of the technical proficiency of the writing, Andy Clark is clearly someone who knows his stuff, and there's a good amount of information packed into a relatively short story. Unfortunately, a lot of it is delivered through exposition. This is a very exposition-heavy book. For example, right at the very start, we're introduced to Lieutenant Keltos, and he's on a mission, and they're walking through a swamp, and you get one of those, Keltos walked through the swamp. His power sword was at his side. His power sword was named this, and it had been with him for this many years. In his other hand, he held his bolt pistol. It was called this, and it had been with him through these many conflicts. Behind him was his second-in-command, Dimitrian, who had been with him through this. And there was it's very much a case of, here's so-and-so, here's what so-and-so is carrying, here's what so-and-so does. A lot of stuff that I would have rather had been introduced more organically. I think if you want to introduce a sword as being important, you don't just want to say, he was carrying his sword and then reel off what the sword had done. I mean, show us the sword being important, you know, explain as it's drawn in combat, and then create that sense of story, the link between the user and the sword, and how that's important. Don't just tell us it's important, show us it's important. And that's my biggest gripe with how the story is written. Sometimes the exposition is so over the top, it's unbelievable. There's a part later on in the story where a demon prince is talking to his minions, and he actually gets the minions to tell him what his plan is. He knows what the plan is, but he says, tell me what my plan is, and then all his minions recite his plan back at him. Not for his benefit, but for our benefit as readers. And again, that's a very sloppy thing to do. It's a way of quickly imparting that information, and I guess maybe because this is a novella, that was deemed the quickest way to get that information out there. But personally, I would have rather seen the plan unfold as it was enacted. I didn't need to know the plan in advance. I didn't need to know what was going on and then see it happen. I would have much rather have those surprises, have those situations revealed to me as the story progressed. So exposition is a problem. There's a number of points where, I mean, a little bit of exposition isn't a problem in and of itself, and sometimes it is the most efficient way to get something done, but there was so much exposition in this book, and it was dealt with in such a heavy-handed way sometimes, it actually drew me out of the story. I'd be getting immersed in a situation, and suddenly it would be like, hold on, we need to explain something to the audience now. So yeah, that was one of my biggest grumbles. However, there is some really beautiful, evocative use of language in this book as well. There are certain moments where Andy Clark, his writing is very, very just utilitarian. It's just, this is what's going on. Then there's some times when it goes really baroque, and it has that very typical Games Workshop style to it, where every word is one of their strange bits of terminology that explains how the different ships operate and things, and it's all very grand, very baroque and gothic. And then sometimes it's almost poetic in what it's doing, and sometimes the use of just a single word is employed in a very particular way, and instantly creates situations where you're getting a lot more sense of the world and the environment than any of those exposition dumps do. For example, there's one point where there's a hull breach, and he describes the atmosphere as shrieking out, and just the use of the word shrieking immediately created that whole scene for me. It's just, you can imagine the sound, you can imagine how the atmosphere is moving. You can imagine like the panicked noise. It was just a really good use of a word. And there's lots of little examples of that throughout. There's a really good one. If I can go back to, in fact, the same page where I had a complaint. So there's a moment here where there's a gunfight going on, and the Silver Templars unleash their bolters on an enemy. And the enemy is described as unnatural bodies danced, burst and burned in the sudden storm of firepower. And again, I just find that a very evocative use of language. You can imagine each bolter shell impacting, the bodies are dancing and they're bursting into fire. It's, dancing is a great word to describe how a body twists and moves under the impact of multiple shots. Really good. Really, really nice use of words. And there are many, many examples of that throughout the story. I wish there was more of that and less of the exposition and the more utilitarian, this is what's happening now. I also found a lot of the dialogue is a little bit stilted. I don't know if that was just because they wanted the Silver Templars to have that particular type of voice, but there were times where the exchanges, I felt they were quite long and elaborate sentences, sometimes in the middle of fighting where a few words could have perhaps conveyed the same thing. But I don't want to dwell too much more on the actual writing style. I mean, everybody's writing style is their own, and I think a lot of people will really enjoy this particular style. For me, there were moments that just drew me out. There were moments that really drew me in, depending on how he was using the language at the time. The other thing I want to talk about briefly is the actual story. And again, I think I'm going to avoid spoilers, but I think this book suffers from being a novella. It suffers from also being incredibly formulaic, and I think it suffers from telling the wrong story. What we have is a very traditional structure to the story. At the start, we have Sergeant Keltos and his team. They're on a mission, and during this mission, Keltos faces a demon prince called Mitoxus, and they have a fight, and the result of the fight is inconclusive, but both of them feel like their honor has been irreparably damaged as a result of that conflict. And that all sort of happens in a prologue. And then we literally get an insert in the book that says 21 years later. I almost read it in a SpongeBob SquarePants voice, but 21 years later. And then we cut to Keltos, who is now a captain, and he's just setting off on another mission. And it's another mission where this demon prince Mitoxus has turned up. And the rest of the book is that second mission. The problem for me is that 21-year gap between the prologue and the main story seemed to have the most interesting story in it. Because once again, as Keltos is flying off with his team to this new mission, we get a huge info dump, a huge block of exposition talking about what happened in the 21 years in between. And he was actually stripped of his title, and he had to work a lowly job. He had to build his way back up, and then he was gradually allowed to go out on combat missions again, and he worked his way up the ranks and then eventually became a captain. But it took a long time, and there was a lot of hard work, and he still doesn't feel like he's redeemed his honor. And there are other people around him that do not believe he has redeemed his honor either. That, to me, is like a big chunk of the story that we get as exposition. And this could well be, it's a problem with it being a novella. They had to cut to the chase, because this book actually feels like it should be the last quarter of a full novel. And I want to read that full novel. I want to read that section, that 21 years, that section of the book that we don't get, because that's where all the character development is. That's where all the character growth is. That's where he's broken down to his base level and has to work his way back up. And he's technically not allowed to go out on missions at this point when he's building his way back up. And I feel like they could have really played up the aspect of this demon prince wants to have a second round with him. And I think it would have been interesting if the demon prince had been constantly doing things and Silver Templars were going out to fight this demon prince, maybe losing battles, losing planets or whatever, and Keltos is forced to stay behind and watch, and he has to stay behind and watch his chapter getting decimated, he has to watch his allies being killed, until eventually he gets the opportunity to go back out there and face his demons and redeem his honor. It's like a whole section of the character development is just not there. I would have loved to have seen Mitoxis constantly trying to get him to come out, lure him out, and setting up these situations to tease him and show that he was killing people he knew and that sort of thing. Because once we get past that exposition dump that tells us what happened in the 21 years, it's just a great big firefight. The rest of the book is the mission, and it's a huge battle. It's a battle waged on many fronts with different teams of people, but it is full-on action all the way, which is very exciting. But for me, it's a problem because I never felt like I'd really got to know any of the characters well enough. I hadn't been through those low points with Keltos, so I didn't feel like I was enjoying watching him get his chance for redemption. They talk about the fact that at the beginning of the book he's very skilled and very meticulous, and then in the later stages of the book he's more aggressive, less calculated because he's more focused on his vengeance. But again, you're told that without really seeing it, without having gone through that journey to see him beaten down and broken down, and then to see him clawing his way back up, but clawing his way up through violence rather than through his efficient training. It's a lot of interesting stuff that just gets excised to get to the big fight at the end, which is an exciting fight. I'm not gonna deny that. It's a really exciting fight. It's got a bit of space battles in there, as well as the fighting with the ground troops, and it does have an interesting resolution to the whole thing. Obviously, I can't tell you anything about that because I don't want to ruin it, but I just wanted to be more engaged with the characters than I was. And again, this is a problem with it being a novella. I'm going to keep saying that. It's a problem with the fact that this could have been a really good full book. And I know it could have been a really good full book, because even though I wasn't 100% engaged with the characters, and even though I felt that they skipped over all the good bits, all the crunchy bits, at the end of the book, I still had a lump in my throat. Towards the end of the book, there's a very moving moment, and I was genuinely moved by it. I was a little bit emotional, a little bit cut up about it, and that was without being really engaged with the characters. If I had had more of the book, more of the character development, that would have been hugely more powerful again. I think the potential is there. The potential was there for a really, really good, engaging story with lots of action and good character beats, but most of those character beats just aren't there. But I guess that's it, really. I don't have a lot else to say, really. Overall, I enjoyed it. I mean, it may not sound like I enjoyed it. It probably sounds like I've ripped it apart a little bit. I did enjoy it. It's a solid read. It's a short read. You'll get through it in a couple of sessions. I think Silver Templars fans will enjoy it. They will enjoy seeing their chapter in action. But I couldn't help feeling at the end of it like I wanted a full book, and it should have been a full book, and I couldn't help feeling that the best bit of the story never made it into the book. But that's it from me for now. Thank you so much for listening to this rather rambling review. If you've enjoyed the video, please consider pressing the like button. If you really enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing if you don't already do so. And hopefully, I will see you all again very soon. Bye bye everyone. Bye bye.